welcome to the 7th installment of Dissecting Capitalism. There are 3 more, and they're on the quarter sheets around. This one is entitled Political Economy of the Environment. We are really grateful to have Amy Rowe here. She's going to tell us a riveting story, I've heard. And Colin, who is also a member of the Education and Training Group, which has been putting on this series. And so what we'll do, we'll probably just have Amy talk first, and then Colin, and then we'll have small group discussions. Maybe it'll only be a couple groups, but then we'll bring it back together for one big group discussion. And so probably before the discussions, I'll send around the donations packet. This is for Lava Space. We're so grateful to be hosted here. And so anything you can donate is appreciated. And let's just get started.
Great. Well, I made a handout for everybody because I'm that kind of girl. The story I'm going to share with you guys tonight is one that's incredibly personal to me. So I hope I can make it through the night without crying, but as often when I share the story, I can't control myself. So forgive me if that is the case. So, are we all fish eaters in here? We seafood, and so maybe you're aware, maybe you're not so aware of the situation with wild fisheries in the global aquatic environment. They're in really bad shape. There are a number of scientific studies put out in the last 4 or 5 years that have predicted that wild fisheries are going to collapse permanently due to overfishing within our lifetimes. And on the front of your little handout here, I have one of these studies, which is the most recent one. It was from a lady that I know, Karen Lindbergh, and she's at one of the state universities in New York. And she's got her prediction of worldwide wild fisheries collapse happening in around 2040. So this is a problem of tremendous impact for our global food system because the largest animal species traded in the world is fish, and wild fish are an incredibly important part of the marine environment. But it's also a story that's very personal to me and one that I want to share with you. And that is because I am from Delaware, but my family for many generations grew up on the Chesapeake Bay. And there is a long history of interactions between people, communities, and marine species for many generations. And there's one of those in particular that I got very involved in my dissertation research, and I just defended my doctoral dissertation in October. So what I'm sharing with you today is part of that study. The American shad in the Susquehanna River. And I got involved in this river herring fisheries issue because I saw a picture, which is the picture on the front of this, but I also made it really big so you can see. I'm going to give it to my human easel, Leon. This is a photo that I saw in a historical society when I was in a little town in Maryland with my grandma. And what you're seeing there is a very vibrant fishery where people are fishing for this migratory fish. It's kind of like a salmon in that it lives in the ocean and spawns upriver every year. But unlike the salmon, they spawn again and again and again. And this doesn't happen anymore. This situation with this, you know, any member of this photo could be a relative of mine. This is a situation where this doesn't occur anymore. And instead, the image that you see on the side of the riverbank now is one that is kind of like this. And this is like a sign on the side of the Susquehanna River. And there's this sign here, no kill for shad. And there's a sign here, notice, closed season on shad. So here we've got 1890-ish, maybe the late 1880s, an incredibly vibrant resource use. And now we've got none. now it's illegal to take them. So I wanted to understand how that came about, which is what I had devoted the last few years of my life to, is trying to come to terms with this. And what makes it so very hard for me, what makes it so very personal is that I'm from this environment and this community that collapsed the American shad. I'm responsible. My ancestors are responsible because they took actions that took a species down to a point where now it's extirpated from the river, meaning that it doesn't exist in the wild there anymore, and instead it's artificially propagated. So there are two parallel stories going on here for me. There is the story of worldwide fishery collapse. We have dramatic problems covered in the New York Times and various major news outlets about what's happening with wild fisheries. And then we've got a fish that collapsed 100 years ago, is now forgotten as part of our social memory. And how are these two stories connected? And how can we learn about what happened to a historic fishery and a historic fish collapse to understand what we're doing with the environment when we take something that's wild and natural and part of a river and make it a resource that we turn into a commodity and we exploit for money, for identity, for a lot of visual purposes, and then at the same time we're destroying that river and changing that river, and the river has become now an energy, it's become an energy system with hydroelectric power plants, and tomorrow the Susquehanna River Basin Commission is going to vote on water withdrawals for natural gas drilling, for fracking. So the basin's being fracked, the basin's being exploited as an energy source, and at the same time, you know, what's really going on there? How are we suffering with that? And so my political economy kind of question that I ask myself is, what can we learn about a society and their interactions with one another, with nature, by how they treat their fish? And I think that looking at the environmental problem, looking at the problem of capitalism, looking at the problem of political economy of resource collapse, can really, if we just take one fish in one river, we can take a little window into that story. So that's sort of how this journey began for me, and that's the place that I'm from. And a lot of times when you think about doing research or looking at things in an academic way or in a scholarly way, the language that's used is we're going to use a lens to look at something in a particular way. We're going to use the political economy lens, we're going to use postmodern lens or Marxist lens, these lenses that we use to sort of look through and make it clear. And the discussion for me has become, lenses are only going to get us so far. Really, that is a mirror. We are looking back at a reflection of ourselves through this process, which for me has become incredibly personal, because I'm not just looking back at who I am, I'm looking back at my entire social identity as being one of river exploitation and fishery collapse. So that's where we're, does anybody have questions? I don't want to, I speak kind of fast, I'm going to try to slow down. So I'll just take you on a 10,000-year journey of this fish. So back in the olden days when the North America was covered with ice, the river was frozen. You can see a map here of the river. This on the back, you have your map. The river, this is the Susquehanna Basin. I put a little star on top of Philadelphia so you can kind of orient yourself. It's the basin west of the Delaware Basin. And the Delaware Basin has kind of a similar story. Their fishery has a little bit of a different experience than the Susquehanna Basin one, which was really got screwed. This was frozen, right? Frozen solid. So this giant ice sheet called the Laurentide ice sheet covered like a lot of North America, and there was no flowing water here. So when climate change happened at the end of the last glacial ice age, there started to be water in this river. and fish started showing up in this river. And lo and behold, the same time the fish show up in this river to do their spawning is the same time communities showed up in this river basin to have their families too. So in my research, I documented about 10,000 years of human societies and fish living together in this river basin in a manner that didn't cause collapse. They didn't need to, tack up signs that said no fishing. It was governed by a different system. There was a different type of knowledge about what the river is, and there was a different type of knowledge about what resources are. So to give an example of how different that perspective is, on the front of your handout I've put a little rock carving image. And this rock carving image was traced from a petroglyph that now no longer is intact. It was in the Susquehanna River, but when they built a large hydroelectric dam, they were going to submerge this thing under the lake that's formed behind the dam. So some brilliant people got the idea to drill holes in the rock and to put dynamite in those holes and to blow it up. And so now chunks of this large elaborate art system are kind of scattered everywhere, and this is just one of them. There are on this dozens of these fish petroglyphs, and these are American shad petroglyphs. Some archaeologists have used the dimensions of American shad and their features to sort of name this fish. And what looks different to this to me, what looks so remarkably different is that in our world, in the Western world, in my research I call it kind of like this Occidental worldview based on resource exploitation and commodification of the natural world. We look at things in a very different way. When we draw pictures of fish, they always look like this, where the fish is sort of sideways, like swimming by. But for some reason, this community that lived on the Susquehanna River for thousands of years, before Europeans came, they looked their fish in the eye. Their faces are forward. When I've been thinking about how our relationships with nature are dramatically different now, we no longer look it in the eye. This is an uncomfortable position to be in our interaction with nature now, especially with fish. So, here we have an example just of, how these things are represented. And there are myths and ceremonies that have been documented that have survived genocide in the river basin that give a kind of clue that this is a spiritual relationship that people had with fish, not just one based upon commodities. So through the course of the fishery, people did things to maximize fishing once Europeans came. When they arrived, there were like a lot of fish going on, they were spawning every year, and they didn't know how to catch them. It's interesting because in Europe, before Europeans came over to this country in the colonial era, their inland fisheries had been collapsed since the Middle Ages. So they didn't know how to fish for inland fish. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the technology to do it. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to do it. So they looked at what was going on with indigenous fisheries, and they took indigenous fishing techniques and they adapted them so that they could harvest for themselves. And in a lot of cases, they ramped up to an enormously large scale what an indigenous fishing technology would be. There's one example that I can give you of it's like a trap made out of rocks, and the trap is shaped like a V with the pointy end of the V downriver, so that fish, as they're swimming up, they kind of get sucked in and then they get caught in this sort of vortex of water. And you would have a person standing at the base of this thing with a basket, and he'd catch a fish, and then, they would have this going on for a couple of hours or whatever. And then when they're done fishing, they leave, and this thing is still there, but it's not catching any fish, and the fish just sort of pass through. And in the colonial era, these became giant machines, where instead of having this vortex come down and having a man with a basket, they built little wooden structures at the bottom with these wooden slats, and the fish would just rack up on these slats 24 hours a day, and then your fisherman didn't have to be there. He could just arrive every once in a while with a big bag and a shovel, and he could shovel the fish into his bag, and then he could take them off and salt them or use them as fertilizer. So the entire technology of fishing changed over time. And nobody really knows when the fishery collapsed. There's a definition for collapse, meaning that the population, it gets to like 10% of its known levels. Nobody kept records back then about what known levels were. But I have here for you a few sort of indications here about what we can kind of think about as collapse and what it looks like. And we've got a classic fishery collapse where our landings, like the number of pounds of fish that we're catching, are really high, and then they drop off dramatically. And this early date is like the beginning of scientific record keeping on this. And some folks think that the peak in fishing was actually around 1830, so it was about 60 years before they started keeping records. The bottom graph is, I think, an even more interesting one, which is what people consider to be the size of a normal fish. And one of the things about shad as a fish is that it repeats. It'll spawn year after year, unlike salmon that spawn once and they die. So if you catch all the fish and only the babies from one reproductive cycle get to spawn once, the population of normal fish gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that is what happened. And it actually, in the 19th century, the size of an average fish was cut in half. So this is kind of a very scary situation for biodiversity. All of the energy of the ocean, where these fish are living 5 or 7 years before they come back to spawn, that energy gets brought upriver and is harvested. So one of the things that happened as a result of all of this overfishing and the development of canal dams for transporting coal across the state of Pennsylvania, and as a result of mill dams that manufactured all the goods of the heartland of Pennsylvania and Lancaster County, and then the hydroelectric power plants that came later, is something that to me is maybe the most distressing part of this story. And that is that at the time period, scientists portrayed an image to America that they could solve the problem. Fishery collapse was a technical problem for which knowledge could control. And in the process of doing that, the American shad, this fish in this river, became one of the very first scientifically managed wild species ever. And it's been scientifically managed since the 1870s, continuously. And what science was able to do was to collapse the fish all the way. The scientific process of knowledge generation, of looking for information instead of resolving problems, was so dramatic, and it had such an authority in the world of policy making and interacting with the public that the fish never had a chance. Once science got involved, then it was pretty much over. So there are a number of things that scientists did to sort of exacerbate the problem, which are still going on today. One of the things that they did is they started raising these fish artificially. Fish culture is what it used to be called, which is sort of like based on agriculture, and now we have aquaculture. So back in the 19th century, they called this fish culture. And what that was taking fish and taking their eggs and taking their fish sperm, which is called milt, and mixing them in a steel bowl, and then raising them in these jars that they invented for this purpose, which they still use today, and then taking the little baby fish that are born and releasing them back into the river as a way of planting fish. So they got on this kick. They planted these fish all the time. They had huge hatchery programs. We still have huge hatchery programs. They all sort of were initiated out of this initial process. And for example, trout are not native in Delaware, yet hatchery trout have been released in Delaware for a really, really long time, including just this past week. So we're doing a lot of scientific tinkering in the natural world to just take control over it. And in the process of doing that, the hubris involved in being able to control and manage a natural system for economic benefit was so very strong and so very pronounced that in the end, I really think that the responsibility of science for causing environmental problems and diverting our attention from the things that we really need to be talking about, for example, our relationships with nature, why we don't look fish in the face as being a cause, are more important than that. So I have on the back here just a piece of art from a book which shows what a hatchery would look like back in the olden days. And then there's some large-scale hydroelectric dams that are on the Susquehanna River. And one of them, the bottom one, the Conowingo Dam, which is a pretty famous dam, it is 10 miles from the mouth of the river to the Chesapeake Bay. So the fish only get 10 miles of river before they're obstructed by a 100-foot tall wall of cement. And in order to get these fish over, one of these technical solutions that have been designed by the scientific community in order to have the energy system of hydroelectric power and the natural system of wild fish coexist is this elevator system, which I have a few pictures of for you. So what happens is that there's a giant electric bucket that's dripped down into the water, and fish are swimming around the base of the dam. They're confused. Fish orient themselves, migratory fish orient themselves according to water flow, so they're confused because the water is swirling at the base of the dam and they don't know which way to go. They get caught in this bucket or lured into the bucket with water flow, and they're hoisted up, 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 and then the bottom of the bucket opens and they're fed into this chute and they blast out the other side of the dam. So it's a very startling, very dramatic journey for a fish to get to a place where it can ultimately have sex and reproduce, spawning. And this system is also collapsed. So I have for you the number of shad that they were able to hoist over the dam, and it looked like it was improving for a while and then ultimately fell. And the moral of this story is that often we see these signals of the environment improving simply because the natural world has fluctuations, and then all of a sudden the carpet gets pulled out and they're flat on their backs again. So the fish had a serious problem for the last couple of hundred years as a result of the European mindset occupation of the natural world. And I have for you on the back, this is a sort of a graph that I made from one of my advisor at UD, one of his papers on how this process kind of works, which I think is like if you were to use fishery collapse as an example, it's in perfect alignment, which doesn't happen very often where theories and the real world line up so well, but this one does. And so I think, okay, I've tested it, it works really well for the story of the American shad, maybe it's something to think about. And the first sort of step, the first misstep that we've taken in our political economy relationships with the natural world is we objectify nature as a resource. We decide that it's there for our use and our purpose, and this is like the very first step in that direction. And once you do that, once you say, nature, you are a resource to me. You are no longer a peer for which we have a visual relationship or a spiritual relationship. You are now a resource. Then all of a sudden the process of commodification is a point of no return. So to think about the very first step being the process of commodification is an idea, right? This is a way that we visualize. And in the second part of this story, the second stage is that we take nature and these problems and we deal with them as technical issues. So in the case of the American shad, we could just make some elevators and we could hoist a bunch of fish up over the dam and then everything should be fine. Or we can take a bunch of fish and we can take their milk and we can take their eggs and we can mix them and we can make a bunch of babies and we can plant a bunch of fish in a bunch of rivers and everything will be fine. And so this aligns very clearly with this commodification of nature, and this is the mindset, exactly what you could have predicted for the American shad. And then in the final step of the system is where we are now, with this wild fish problem globally, as well as the shad problem in the Susquehanna River specifically. And that is that there is complete scientifically managed technical control over the natural world, to the extent that other views aren't able to participate. If you don't have a scientific knowledge of fisheries, your voice is really diminished. So we've relegated the control of these things to a bunch of experts that we trust are going to have our best interest at heart, when really I question that whole process, this commodification of nature paradigm. So that's kind of the moral of my story, is that this is historic. This has happened over and over so many times that we've now even forgotten. If it weren't for a sign that says no shad, no taking of shad, people wouldn't even know that it's in the Susquehanna River anymore. There's these scientific programs to sort of hoist them over the river and artificially propagate them in hatcheries. So now the only people that have an intimate connection with the wildlife that was so valuable at one time are these technicians who have held the hand of this fish as it's collapsed over the last 130 years. So, and I'll close my story there. Hope I didn't take up too much Alan's time. If there's, I brought a bunch of these. I don't know if there's a need for a copy in the back.
So I want to actually pick up kind of where Amy left off with the issue of, she was talking about how we cede control of certain natural systems to experts, and that turns into a sort of structure where it's difficult to imagine our own agency in what we do about this, when it develops to a point where there's fish elevators and things that it's sort of beyond our sort of comprehension. But what I want to talk about is energy. I'm actually going to go through notes because I know this experience is but is energy, and more specifically energy-society relationships that are embedded in the sort of current development of carbon-neutral and renewable energy sources, including large-scale renewable and nuclear power. It's become clear to some Americans, I guess, that something needs to be done about climate change, but there's a variety of responses to it, everything from opening up domestic reserves to nuclear energy, large-scale industrial renewables. But whatever the response to climate change is, all of the way these responses frame it as technology questions. Given the fact that this climate crisis has been caused in large part by the energy sector, you might think that social relations and our social responsibility might come into play, but so far this hasn't been the case. And instead, what we get are technology fixes of various kinds. And for our purposes here, we can divide these into two camps. One is nuclear camp, and talking about carbon-free options, and industrial scale renewables. So we're talking wind farms, geothermal, huge, large systems. And for a lot of people, this is a cause for celebration. People imagine a future full of green jobs and a green economy, sort of green Manhattan project where you have the coast of Delaware, you have 60 giant turbines, and all of this is promoted with this air of fatalism about a coming disaster, and that's what kind of pushes these technological fixes. And with that kind of fatalism, you would further expect that there would be some expectation of social sacrifice to deal with this problem. But for all the celebration, there is no serious social change promoted in any of these dialogues. Both of these visions, the industrial scale renewable and nuclear energy, indicate a preference to simply alter energy supply inputs rather than transform society-energy relations. Both schemes they suggest that modern society will receive a rising stream of less CO2-rich kilowatt hours, such that energy consumption and economic growth can continue into the future with no end in sight. And in many ways, this vision is not altogether surprising, particularly here in this country. Since the Industrial Revolution, social progress, and particularly in the West, has been measured by material affluence. So in turn, ensuring wealth and its increase has become the responsibility of a set of institutions charged with planning for and delivering a boundless frontier of expanding production and consumption. And so that living well in modern times means a constant flow of rising goods and services delivered conveniently and cheaply, ideally. And so growth without end in this way has become institutionalized as a goal of modern society. Additionally, a life involving less and less interaction with the natural world has also become a hallmark of living well, particularly in the Western world. Separation from the natural world is facilitated by technological advancements which collapse the boundaries of space and time and enable social transactions, interactions that don't have natural limitations to them. And in fact, the middle and upper classes of wealthy societies have little to no need to venture outside anymore. And the result of social alienation from nature leaves mostly the poor to witness the effects of environmental degradation around them. Only their livelihoods are immediately and significantly threatened by the quote, normal pollution of modernity. And this is why we see middle-class environmental organizations seeking redress through these sort of technological solutions. Everyday indoor life has been protected and nourished by technology, so why shouldn't it work for outside as well? But regardless, the sort of clean, technophilic vision of the future is still bound to real material conditions. It relies on, in particular, one essential ingredient, energy. It's the one commodity that is always needed to make and use anything. And in this respect, energy supply is what enables the pursuit of boundless growth in our societies. It's because of modern energy that we can aspire to produce and possess anything and everything. And our energy system actually is really well suited to our age. For decades, thinkers like Amory Lovins have criticized the evolution of our energy systems on the grounds that its scale and volume are poorly matched to the scale and volume of energy use, that is, household level use versus giant power plant. But in fact, this is a really key point in that this is by design, this mismatch. The potential for incessant growth can only be exploited if there's an ever-present capacity to fuel such growth. Having just enough energy presumes this sort of nonsensical idea that there is such a thing as not just enough growth. So modern energy systems only come in extra large sizes because quantity is the only imperative. The volume and scale of output are the standard bearers of serious energy options because these are the metrics of the alliance of capitalism, science, and carbon power. All three run on the principle that more is better. More knowledge, more power, more commodities. These are all signs of progress. And further, this is a self-sealing logic. It forms a feedback loop where massive energy systems support production growth. Social norms foster increased consumption to meet this production, encouraging even more production, which is reliant on energy systems that must continually expand to keep pace, and it just goes around and around and around. And so I'm going to refer to this sort of feedback loop as energy gluttony. Much like biophysical gluttony, it's driven by a need to expand without regard to quality of life. And its motive is the commodification of human life and the environment so the growth of that element can continue. So with gluttony as the modern energy system's core design principle, the reaction to energy shortfalls search for bigger and more machines constantly. And it's important to make clear that this priority is not dependent on actual conditions of shortfall. It's enough to have a forecast of potential insufficiency in present machine capacity to sort of justify the creation of larger and larger systems. And this forecast is always available in a society that seeks growth without end. So the search for a remedy to the problem of climate change, although it has stimulated some rethinking of the underlying sort of social norms that have got us into this mess, the most warmly embraced options are solidly still inside this box. It's nuclear power and industrial scale renewable energies. Both share the quality of history's titan technologies, which are very large in energy terms and in scale of the investment required to actually build them. They reinforce a centralist architecture of energy systems, and they add high doses of supply to feed a system that is just going to go and go and go. And further, they're both predicated on a corporatist technocratic politics that assign power to the values of energy system and its needs with the expectation that society's members will adapt. So it's techno-focused rather than people-focused. It's difficult to even comprehend how any one person could ever run a nuclear plant. So I'm going to look at these a little bit more in detail individually. First will be nuclear. So the proponents of nuclear power cast climate change as a serious threat, as many people do. But the way that climate change is forecast is it's seen as a threat because it has the potential to reverse centuries of social progress. And so we seek a giant furnace, a new furnace, that can reduce carbon emissions while also accelerating global economic activity. So in this situation, it's actually fear of social regression, not environmental damage, that drives this seeking for new solutions. And when people raise concerns about the social and environmental consequences of nuclear power, there's usually a dismissive response. Well, some people acknowledge plant safety, the dangers of plant safety, weapons proliferation, and radioactive waste storage, and so on. You see a lot of people just adopting a policy position that they see as ultimately necessary. They have no choice. We have to do something. And this includes like leading environmentalists. In fact, the Greenpeace co-founder, Patrick Moore, admonished critics of nuclear technology, saying, quote, "If we banned everything that can be used to kill people, we would never have harnessed fire." In fact, he quit Greenpeace because of their non-support for nuclear power. The threat of climate change has led a lot of activists and experts, scientists, to justify restarting a nuclear power development. Now, since Fukushima, it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens because there's new fears of plant safety. But a key aspect of this approach is venerating scientific knowledge, that science can ultimately solve any outstanding problems, including plant safety, environmental degradation, and dealing with the waste. And we'll get to it, science can handle it. So the threat of climate change has also seen advance the sort of project of renewable energy systems significantly over the last 20, 30 years or so. And the power and profit projections that you see for nuclear power or old coal power plants is now actually you're seeing for giant industrial scale renewables, which is pretty new. And it's this sort of corporate vision has launched something of like a Manhattan Project for green energy. This new order is sort of visualized. I mean, if you think about it in your head, you just see these sort of benign nature, pastoral setting with giant wind turbines and everything's fine. And further, to garner support for these from modern society, these same turbines are applauded for the complexity and their scale. They're larger than the Statue of Liberty, and they're used as exotic chemistry of lightweight composites, and they are based on really advanced computer designs of aerodynamics. So again, we see a preference for science has told us that this will work, so I believe that it works. So rather than questioning the underlying premise of modern society to produce and consume without constraint, green energy advocates warmly embrace creating bigger and more complex machines to sate an ever-increasing world energy demand. And there's a further problem with extra large green energy project, and it's its distinctive environmental alienation that it has the potential to produce. The march of commodification is spurred by the green titans as they seek to enter historic commons areas, such as mountain passes, pasture lands, coastal areas, the oceans, in order to collect renewable energy. So although it's not formally possible to privatize things like the wind or solar radiation, the extensive technological systems and lattices that are created to harvest this renewable energy functionally preempt commons managements of these resources. It's privatization through economies of scale and appropriation through unbalanced competition. So what you have are companies developing turbines that are taller than the Statue of Liberty rather than, smaller than a car. And talking about what Amy was just discussing, previous efforts to harvest kinetic energy of flowing waters and dams should have taught designers of mega green energy and their environmentalist allies that the potential environmental and social effects of this will be massive, and they will preempt commons-based management. It's happened across this country. But instead of learning this lesson, there's a technophilic awe that inspired earlier creations of these giant coal systems and centralized networks, and that's now applied to efforts to tame wind, water, sunlight. Again, all just with a focus on endless growth. And this will move us sort of towards discussion, I think, is, so we can talk about what women do all day, where can we go from there? Obviously, shedding the institutions that help create the danger of climate change is not going to happen within a sort of green titan system or nuclear power. If institutional change is going to occur, the energy society relationships that underlie them must be transformed, and we'll have to design and experiment with alternatives. And clearly outside the box alternatives are not going to be sensible in a modern context, but that's not necessarily bad. In fact, we need ideas and actions that fail in one way in particularly the context of energy gluttony. To that end, I actually want to I'm going to mention a concept and a practice known as a sustainable energy utility. Amy and I met at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy at the University of Delaware, and this is a model that was developed by them. It's in use in a couple states, but that's not really important. I want to make clear that I'm not promoting this model specifically, but it will allow me to sort of talk about things that we should be looking for in other tools as we move forward. So it's a sort of a convenient thing. To let you know, the sustainable energy utility involves the creation of, it's sort of an economic / policy model. You create an institution that has the explicit purpose of enabling communities to reduce and eliminate their use of gluttonous energy resources. It's used as a bond measure where people treat it just like an actual utility, and they can pay into this rather than using their regular utilities. So what I want to talk about specifically using the SEU is the concepts of commonwealth, community trust, and commons, which are the principles that the SEU is sort of designed upon. And these are the things that I think we should be considering and looking for in tools that we develop and experiment with and consider as we move forward. So energy tools that we experiment with should create the conditions for a commonwealth economy that can prosper by investing in the sustainability of community and its life web. The Commonwealth arises from an ongoing mutual promise to share the costs of building an energy scheme that uses less, and when use is desired, it supplies energy from renewable sources organized locally by and for the community. The benefits of needing less, then, can be directly valorized and shared in the form of lower community costs deriving from less use. In this way, the benefits pay for the costs. Further, the choice of renewable supplies enables the preservation of local resources and energy ecosystem services. By paying together to promote sustainability, collective gains ensue from improved public health and biodiversity to recovered natural experience. And what this will allow communities to do is think together about what kind of energy system is most appropriate for them, rather than relying on what the directives of massive investment firms to just pull energy from huge offshore wind farms. their particular locality may be better suited to, I mean, it could be small hydroelectric, it could be wind resources, it could be, but it depends, it's different from place to place. Yeah, but so in the instance of Commonwealth investment, a community can forego the cost of endlessly building abundant energy machines, these giant machines, which ultimately harm human and ecosystem health. And the community can also avoid endless construction of infrastructures of remediation and restoration that societies with gluttonous energy systems constantly have to do. So the second tool, or the second sort of metric that we might use to evaluate further energy tools is community trust. We want to look for tools that can enable the formation of community trust. That is governance by the community rather than technocratic institutions and values. Shared use of and collective responsibility for the health of renewable energy and other ecosystems defines the politics of the new energy commons. The definition conforms with two critical elements of a commons regime. First, it offers a means by which energy decisions are based on streams of common benefits for the community. And secondly, it emphasizes the social governance of energy in order to protect the community's interests rather than the interest of the energy producers. In this way, community values instead of commodity values are what determine policy directions. This confronts the energy challenge by embedding decision-making in the community itself. Uses of the Commonwealth are decided by community members who govern in the sense of setting goals, monitoring performance, and enforcing rules. There's also a personal and interpersonal sense of governance in which the meaning and practice of sustainability and equity are created and continually revised by community members. Members' efforts to secure Commonwealth commitments lead to the interplay of the institution, the individual, and groups around practical problems of how to use less and how to match social needs and renewable energy availability. So in this way, it actually can help people learn how to do this better over time and to govern themselves. And of course, commons-based politics are not without the potential for conflict. Differences will arise and they need to be confronted. But in the case of gluttonous energy regimes, the remedy is always cornucopia. It's more will resolve whatever conflict that there might be. In this regard, the difference between the politics of the commons and that of cornucopia is not the relative presence or absence of conflict, but the presence or absence of community trust, which can be used to solve such conflict. And when conflict arises, the resolution must come from a restoration of trust and through the sharing of resources and responsibilities. And lastly, commons, the notion of commons. Unfortunately, most understandings when we think of commons come from Eric Hardin's paper, The Tragedy of the Commons. He conceived of the commons as a natural resource bundle or an actual physical area. And commons management was defined as the informal social scheme used to govern access to and use of those resources in the commons. So normally you think of grazing areas, that's usually a common example that's used. And he regarded the scheme, he regarded the governance scheme as leading to virtually unregulated access and use because enforcement, due to the informality of the scheme, was weak. So he concluded that environmental plunder would be the ultimate consequence, and he suggested the only way to avert this is to privatize the areas, commodify them, or use them as publicly regulated zones with strong economic incentives and penalties to guide access and use. And so a lot of research came out and supported his position about the idea of commons management is an out-of-date idea, and we just need to commodify it and set up rules to do it. But the tragedy doesn't really lie in the commons itself, but rather it's the idea, the modern idea of it, and the human personality that is regarded as normal or practical in these models. The argument assumes the centrality of commodity-based relations. It's presupposed that human beings who strive for wealth without limit are rational, leading many researchers to search for solutions to the tragedy using sophisticated rational actor models. However, there's a lot of human populations that have demonstrated that commons governments can work and it provides for long-term environmental sustainability. So it seems that the tragedy studies tell us more about what moderns do if they suddenly found themselves in a commons than about commons history per se. And this begs the question, should we abandon commons governance because of the modern mentality, or should we work to change the modern mentality with one more suitable to commons governance? I think we should look for steps or tools that help us take steps towards the latter. Although commons institutions don't necessarily guarantee the eradication of environmentally exploitative practices, they do offer a step towards the recovery of political agency, which I think is key, in the formation of choices regarding energy and environmental futures. And it will also allow us to sort of reconstruct the normative foundations of what we think of as the good life. So just to close, rather than relying on technical miracle elixirs, even the carbon-free ones, I'm suggesting that the onset of human-induced climate change brought by 200 years of modern energy practice should spur us to try earnestly to shift the paradigm. There are lots of tools that have the potential to dismantle energy gluttony. Through a resurgent community voice seeking to govern energy, ecology, society relations, it may be possible to render a different energy future. And this task will be difficult. Regimes develop through the interplay of technology and society over time. We come to feel that we have no way out. I mean, they govern us in many ways. They alter history, and then they seek to prevent change, except in ways that bolster the existing power of that regime. Of specific importance here, gluttonous utilities will not simply cede political and economic success to an antithetical institution, the tools that we're trying to develop and imagine. And this is why change is so hard to realize. Shifting a society towards a new energy regime requires diverse actors working in tandem across all areas of regime influence. Economic models, political will, social norm development, all of these things must be shifted rather than pulled from the current paradigm. However, by choosing community governance over technocratic orders, we have the chance to do something impossible in the era of energy gluttony, our current era, and that is to relocate energy, ecology, society relations as a commons space. Using commons tools such as the Commonwealth economy, community trust, we can place new values above speed, quantity, extra large, and growth. Energy sustainability and energy justice can be secured as the desired and proper outcomes of the energy, ecology, and society relations that we want. So that's the end. So I think we were going to, well, I don't know if you
Yeah, thanks, Colin.
Oh, hi.
I hope you can meet some time. Other interesting questions that you wanted to complicate that question with.
Yeah, it really comes down to trust. And until there's structure that can facilitate trust, we're kind of stuck. I'm very aware of that because trust has been a personal issue for me. I've always been into technology. I've always been into understanding structures. And ultimately, you can't use technology to solve a human issue. But there is technology about social trust that can be used, perhaps, to alleviate our mutual mistrust that lets the industrialists take over the systems that are supposed to serve us.
I like that. Or I was gonna say, like, I feel like it's all about a mindset, and it's all about how we treat each other and things like that are at the root of removing those like industrialist setups where it's like, and they just left, but somebody was like, I don't think a green solution is going to be any good difference from whatever else, and it's like, yeah, no, but like, I think we want to all be on that page. It's about how we're thinking about energy and like thinking about huge systems that benefit us and things like that. Sorry, I didn't lose my train of thought.
But I think we're in such a deep crisis, and the history is so pervasive, the social control is so complete, that to even look at and see the institutional dimension of what's going on is very, very difficult for most people, because it's like fish in the water. And while I think it's great that we could have sort of more individual or small-scale solutions, we're also going to have to get at those bigger institutions of society. And we know that over at least the last 500 years, there's been a process of rape, murder, and mental colonization that's brought us to this present place where the solution is not going to come from government bureaucrats alone. It's not going to come from the nonprofit industrial complex driven by a profit motive in the market, which can be so readily co-opted and compromised, so that whereas maybe the tribal people here, before the Europeans came, had a sense that their fate is tied directly to the herds of animals and to the life that they're partners with, that they are part of this one universe together. We're nowhere near that. So how are we going to get to this institutional level where, even if I have my personal autonomy, some monster corporation is going to keep putting heavy metals into fish, poisoning the Chesapeake Bay, the water is going to be full of toxins. We are going to have to be able to take our individual consciousness and be able to grapple with those big institutions of society, and it's really, a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I feel like we should be cautious that though we know we're fighting against institutional thinking and structural problems, that we don't necessarily structure our resistance in the form of an institution, because these traits that Colin described as admirable ones of the sustainable energy utility, commonwealth economy, community trust, and commons, these sound a lot to me like things that I've worked with in terms of care ethics, so things about particularity in a community and the context and a really deep understanding of power relations and awareness of paternalism and all of these things. And a lot of these traits that go into good care, or these three traits that Colin mentioned, I think are not really possible to institutionalize. That once you try to institutionalize these, they stop functioning. So I wonder whether we can structure a resistance that isn't institution-based, but is strong enough to fight the institutional damage.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think that one of the problems with renewable energy is that although there are certainly people that can make profit off of solar panels or wind or something like that. Again, Obama just told the Chinese and the Europeans not to fund their solar panels and said we should be funding ours. But I think one of the problems with capitalism is that although you can make money off those things too, you can't move those things. Fossil fuels or uranium, you can move them around and sell them in other places. You can make a lot of profit off that. Like a poor region can sell, the earth to mining companies so they can try to at least, even though they create a dependency, make money off their resources. And you can't do that when you have a solar panel or windmill, because it can just all those power that area. I think there's bigger reason than just energy. I think it's agriculture and a lot of other things are done. But I think that's one of the reasons we haven't progressed beyond that, is because capitalism loves to move things around and sell them.
Yeah, I was beginning to explain some things, but first I want to relay upon what you're just saying. There are alternative energy methodologies where it is possible to transport the energy produced. Hydrogen is one of them, and it's possible to produce hydrogen on a scale that basically, it produces more energy from the system than what is gotten now. This is called over-unity technology. It's through electrolysis, and it's technology that people don't know about. And it's possible to do this on a much smaller scale, on a local scale. And it's possible to implement this type of technology. Wait, hold on 1 second. I want to refer back to what you're speaking about with the problem with institutionalization. It is a huge problem, but the fact is, right now, our society is built upon institutions and and it has major limitations, but it's possible to actually utilize the utilities infrastructure of these institutions and convert them essentially instantly over to alternative energies, such as the one I just explained in a sentence. And basically it's possible to create the change in a centralized facet, but then trickle it down while different communities can implement their own energy alternatives. There's two major facets of energy in society. There's energy in the field of communities in the context of our own personal lives, but then there's energy in the context of industry, and energy in the context of industry requires massive amounts of energy, and it requires like centrally located production. Some people are not in favor of any industries whatsoever, or like civilization, but for those who are in favor of civilization or wish to live in a world of some form of civilization that can harmonize with nature, it's possible to change that. But anyways, yeah, there's multiple energy alternatives that have been suppressed a lot. Like many people don't know all the possibilities that we have, and I just named one, and there's multiple others. This is just one that could be easily implemented now. That's why I'm bringing it up and explained it briefly. I mean, we could talk more about details of it if whomever wishes.
There was an interesting thing that came in our group, and you were talking about your house, and like, sort of recognizing your own energy use through that. And it was sort of the skill development, I guess, that happened. And it's not maybe necessary, at least as I see it, for everybody to know how to install their own solar panels, but it like put you in immediate contact with exactly how much energy like a toaster uses. And then 18 brought up, like, but not everybody can do that, not everybody's an energy nerd, I think somebody said. And like, yeah, and that's true. But so, while I think that's, replacing, there's sort of like a mid-step kind of question. Is it, do we take sort of a stepping stone, like, sort of using the large system that we have? Is that going to end up, though, that's just going to continue us on this process where people really don't know where their energy comes from and how much they use when they do different things, which is really we're going to find ourselves in the same hole. It's just going to look different. But I think,
It eliminates fossil fuels, though, which is a big thing.
Right, no, that's true. Yeah,
huge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a big thing.
So there's got to be ways, and the question is, if you have, 3 kids and you work 2 jobs, how is it possible to bring people closer to knowledge of like how much energy they use? There's a lot of talk of even just smart metering, things that are inside the house, so you can just see it.
They make us think there's an energy crisis. It's just we use much more energy than we need. I think there's like a crisis of jobs. Most jobs are totally unnecessary. And disruptive actually. And I think that if we just educate people one-on-one in our communities and somehow grow from there rather than institutionalizing even ourselves, and there's just more trust I think in that way. And most people are really not interested in having a 3,000 square foot house that's heated from top to bottom, and indoor pool or whatever. Most people are just want to pay their bills and and be happy. But it's like made us think that somehow these huge office buildings downtown require all this energy. It's not true. I mean, people lived without indoor plumbing and electricity for thousands of years. They got up when the sun came up and they went to bed when it got dark. It's like, I don't know, that's what animals do. And birds, I know, they get up as soon as you hear them, right? 6 a.m., 5 a.m.
I do hope whatever politically happens, there will be a Green Deal just to create jobs, as you're talking about energy and for ourselves to locally make it. I know Pico's rolling out smart grid. They've already put in all the hardware. It's just a matter of coming out shortly where they can isolate the grid locally, so we can plug in power and they can actually cut it off, so there won't be these massive brownouts we've been experiencing. And in reference to other technologies, since I love technology, there'll be something for your phone as well, where you can tap in live to the second what's going on in your house, how much it's drawing, and turn things on and off. So that's, I mean, these are tools. And of course, not everyone will be tapped into how and why, and everyone doesn't have to be, so tapped into energy, but I think the tools will help, and the awareness building is so critical. You're saying that it wasn't always needed, and it's not critical.
Is there anybody who hasn't commented yet?
I mean, just one thing we talked in our group about too a bit was just, the difference between like the technological, or just thinking of it in terms of technological fixes and political, and like, for instance, how much we consume and how much, and like how to control things or whatever, and then the political, how things are set up politically in our relationship to them. And I mean, I mentioned specifically like our alienation from how power is produced. We don't have just like all commodities, we don't have a direct relationship to that. And changing that, like having a real, like for instance, our house runs on solar power off the grid, and we have like, we're so in tune with how much power we use. I just wanted to also just like to respond a bit to some of the comments about that, is just like, like when we set up our house, a few other houses popped up that did similar things, like a couple squats and another house that folks who bought their house just a couple blocks down. And it was just interesting because none of us had done that stuff before, and a bunch of us also worked and stuff. But we really like, just from that, we shared all this knowledge together, and we exchanged so much information, and often like, we'd go out, we'd like get the stuff together or whatever, like that we needed. And I was just like, just thinking about that made me think of like, just kind of like the culture of street car mechanics, how, like if anywhere in West Philly, you're working on a car, you're like, fuck, you know about cars, and you have your hood open, some old man comes up and starts talking to you, and it's like, oh, have you tried that? And then there's like this crowd around, and you're like, you can just go in and make coffee or whatever, and then there's like this, but just like that, I think that spirit of community figuring things out, it just happens, like, and to me it's like a real inspiring thing when you have, I think that's part of like the connection, like having a more direct connection with what we decommodifying, how, I mean, not like we're completely decommodifying it, but I think it's the level of that.
So let's get maybe a couple more comments from people who haven't spoken, and then I want to use the last 5 minutes or so to give Amy and Colin the last word, give us their sort of final thoughts. But other people haven't spoken up in the big group, please feel free to do so.
So I have several unrelated to each other comments, and one is that I think that for the most part we're steering clear of this idea, I've heard it called the noble savage, but this is like, we should just go back in time and, not that, I agree, we can live without a lot of the things we're used to, like indoor plumbing and electricity and things like that, but to just not get trapped in that idea. Going back in time is not going to solve all our problems, but I think we're doing a good job of that. I had a thought about hierarchy seems to come in where trust fails, and does that mean that there are some communities that are too big to have trust? Is that part of our problem? Is it a problem of scale? I don't know. And I also, it hasn't come up so much in the discussions but in the presentations. I want to make clear that my personal opinion, science is not the enemy. It is a tool. It can be, people's biases come into it. Scientists are people, and, so it can be used to do good things, and it can be used to do bad things, and, that's what I've got.
We have a couple of
I would just say, I agree with that. I think that science is like pretty awesome, and the foundation of science is one like of complete domination. If you want to say like Francis Bacon and Descartes started. Francis Bacon says, put nature on the rack, torture it, and then it will tell you its secrets. And then Descartes says, reduce everything to body, reduce everything to extension, and we will figure out how to live forever, which is like pretty awesome. Like I want, like of course, like you would want like human beings. Of course, like we're all afraid of death in some way. So we come up. There's these scientists who like create the modern project of like trying to live forever, of like trying to like torture nature to get these things. And I think that you can still talk about scientific method or something in a different light of like, I mean, there's tons of scientific things that we don't do. Like we could be experimenting with like how magnetism affects squirrels or like any sorts of things that like we just don't have. And it would be like really interesting, I think, to figure out. There are like different, like birds have different migratory patterns with different magnets and that kind of thing. But that is never going to get funding unless it's a way that it can make money. So science is like an example of how capitalism and economic conditions manage our social abilities and our communities. I would want to go even further and say that the state is controlled by capitalism also, and that we're not going to be able to affect anything ever. But that's somewhat nihilistic. But at least science, we're never going to be able to do anything cool with it until we ruin capitalism first. That's all I want to say.
Okay, I think that we're just only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give it to Colin and Amy to finish up if you guys are ready. Yeah?
Sure. I can say a few things. This is really cool. This is my first experience with this group. And there's something that I'm hearing over and over again in the community that I think is so great that I want to echo back in a sort of in a different frame. And that is the agency in retransforming the structure being one based on trust. And I think that this is a very trusting group right here where we're sharing our ideas. And it's small. And there's a lot of intimacy here. And one of the things that I feel a lot in my life is that boundary in intimacy is something that prohibits me from trusting. And I worry about that. The issue of superior knowledge or of control over resources or of buying experts and doing things like that. Those are real problems that lack intimacy. Yeah. And maybe it's because I'm a woman. I don't know what it is. I don't know the reason, but I feel like this is something that I'm really interested in. I'm really interested about re-injecting intimacy back into social relationships. And this is an example of that, and I think that's very cool. So I'm really glad that I could be here today.
I actually think, what's your name? I'm sorry.
I'm Caleb.
Caleb. What you said right there at the end is exactly, I realized afterwards that I don't hate science or technology. We were trained as scientists or whatever. But, our technology should serve us. It shouldn't dictate actually how we live our lives. We should use these things as tools. And so, like you were saying, like using, even just smartphone, apps that help you monitor your energy uses. Those are examples of ways that it's one step to getting you a little bit closer to like what is real, like the actual kilowatt hours that just click off and just keep going. That's an example of it. So, but I think what Caleb said was exactly right, that I don't hate science. In fact, that all of this is an example of how the directives of capitalism can actually ruin what is essentially, like Dave was saying about the car in the street, that's just what humans like to do, like work together and fix something. And so, but I guess that's it.